Finally, we have the visual everyone was waiting for. The dense atmosphere, the wrought iron, and that feeling that every step on a dirt road could be the last. Looking at the images of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, you feel like you've been transported to a world where honor is the only currency left. But have you ever stopped to wonder why this aesthetic feels so familiar? Why does the weight of this history resonate so strongly within us? The truth is that although we are facing a work of art in fiction, what drives these gears is something much deeper and, I dare say, more brutal than any TV script. A strong statement. What you are seeing is not just a made-up story. It is a reflection of a real social laboratory that shaped our own civilization. The most interesting thing here, and what few people realize, is that almost all the challenges Dunk and Egg face on screen were experienced, bled for, and overcome by real warriors in Anglo-Saxon and Viking Britain. That heavy chainmail, the dilemma of swearing loyalty to a lord, and the daily struggle against hunger and betrayal. All of that was there, in the mud of medieval England, long before it became entertainment. In this video, I'm going to take you inside that screen. We're going to deconstruct what's purely visual, and delve into the forbidden history that served as the foundation for this epic journey. If you're looking to understand the tactics, the weapons, and the real politics behind what we're watching, you're in the right place. But before we unsheathe the steel for this analysis, join our shield wall, leave a like, and subscribe. By doing so, you help spread this knowledge and strengthen our community of past enthusiasts. And tell me below, where are you watching from, and what caught your attention most in this medieval visual? Your opinion can dictate the course of our next great historical investigation. The fog that rose from the English Channel at the beginning of the 5th century brought not only the biting cold of the north, but the silence of a world collapsing. For almost 400 years, Britain had been the extreme limit of Roman civilization. Paved roads cut through forests. Aqueducts carried water to vibrant cities like Londinium and Eboracum, and Hadrian's Wall in the north was the stone scar that separated order from barbarism. However, the heart of Rome was bleeding. Pressed by invasions on its own central borders, the empire made a decision that would change the fate of the British Isles forever: the definitive withdrawal of the legions. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to British civilians that sounded like a death sentence. Defend yourselves. Imagine the terror of a population that had forgotten how to fight, protected for generations by Roman iron, suddenly left at the mercy of Pictish and Scots raiders, and most dangerous of all, Germanic pirates. The power vacuum was absolute. Luxurious villas were abandoned, coins ceased to circulate, and writing almost disappeared. It was in this scenario of ruins and shadows that the seed of England was planted, not by Romans, but by immigrants who crossed the sea in search of land and glory. The Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, did not arrive as a unified army, but as war bands led by ambitious chieftains. Initially brought as mercenaries by local leaders like the legendary and perhaps fictional Vortigern to fight the Picts, these guests soon realized the land was fertile and the locals weak. What followed was a slow and brutal colonization. The ancient British-Roman culture was pushed to the western fringes, to the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, while the new rulers fragmented the island. From this chaos emerged 7 main kingdoms, a structure that historians would call the Heptarchy: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Each of these kingdoms was a social laboratory where the law of the strongest prevailed. Power was not a matter of bureaucracy, but of blood and steel. There was no single England, only a patchwork of kingdoms constantly at war for hegemony. If you watch the political drama of Westeros, but be aware that the Heptarchy was the real and far more deadly version. A land where a king could wake up sovereign and end the day with his head on a stake, only for a new clan chief to claim the title. Bretwalda, the Lord of Britain. The departure of the Romans was not merely a military retreat, it was the end of an era, and the painful birth of a new people who would be born under the sign of the axe and the oath. If you close your eyes and think of a Viking or a Saxon warrior from a modern TV series, you'll probably picture men covered in black leather, metal studs, elaborate face paint, and perhaps wolfskin shoulder guards. It's a powerful aesthetic, but it's a visual lie. However, when we look at the earliest images and descriptions of Sir Duncan the Tall in the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, we found something surprising, a simplicity that echoes the archaeological truth of the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages in a way that few productions managed to achieve. Dunk's armor isn't made of biker leather. It consists of a woolen tunic, a heavy and functional chainmail, and a simple tabard. In the actual history of Anglo-Saxon Britain, leather was almost never used as primary armor. Why? Because leather was treated to be stiff enough to stop an arrow or a sword, the so-called boiled leather. It's expensive to produce, difficult to maintain, and honestly, less efficient than metal or even quilted linen. The elite Saxon or Viking warrior didn't want to look like a Gothic runway model. He wanted to survive the impact of a battle axe. Dunk's most distinctive visual feature is his chainmail. Each iron ring was riveted on by hand. It was a feat of engineering that took months to complete. Watching Dunk tend to his armor, cleaning off the rust and ensuring it served its purpose, perfectly reflects what a then Saxon nobleman would do it. For the Anglo-Saxons, armor wasn't a costume, it was an inheritance. Often a good coat of chainmail would pass from father to son for 3 generations. It defined who a man was. If you wore chainmail, you were somebody. If you fought only in a woolen tunic and a wooden shield, you were cannon fodder. Furthermore, there is the element of color. Modern fiction loves gray and brown, but the Saxon world was vibrant. They loved garish colors, deep blues, reds drawn from poppy roots, and intense yellows. A prestigious warrior, as well as a knight seeking to highlight his coat of arms in a tournament, wanted to be seen. The aesthetics of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It revives this idea of the functional warrior. There are no horns on the helmets, which, incidentally, never existed historically, and there is no excess of useless adornments. There is the weight of the iron, the smell of sweat on the padding, and the understanding that, on the battlefield of Malden or in the tournament of Vofrexo, what keeps you alive is the skill of the blacksmith who forged each link of your protection, and not how threatening your black leather looks under the moonlight. And if you enjoy this search for the truth behind the myths, be sure to check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Here, we dissect history so you can see the past through the eyes of those who were there. To understand the society that gave rise to the Vikings and the kingdoms of England, you need to stop thinking of money as paper or numbers on a screen. Back then, value was measured in life: cattle, silver, and slaves. When we say that an elite warrior, the historical equivalent of George R.R. Martin's knight, entered the field, he was literally wearing the value of an entire village. The equipment wasn't just protection, it was the accumulated capital of a lineage. Let's look at the numbers based on ancient legal codes such as River Law, a high-quality sword, forged using the pattern welding technique, where different types of iron were twisted to create a Damascus effect, cost about 7 cows. For an average peasant who perhaps owned 2 cows to support his entire family, a sword was an object of science fiction, something unattainable. But the sword was the cheap part. The real luxury was body protection. A chainmail coat, Bernie IT, cost at least 12 cows. Add to that a sturdy helmet, 6 cows, a reinforced shield, a spear, and, most expensive of all, a trained warhorse. In total, equipping a single first-rate warrior cost the equivalent of 30 or 40 oxen. In modern terms, it's as if an average soldier wore a Kevlar vest, but the elite warrior went into combat driving a Ferrari. This created an absolute military inequality. If 10 men equipped in this way faced 50 peasants with pitchforks and lumberjacks' axes, the peasants would be massacred. The real story wasn't about who had the biggest army, but about who had the most expensive human tanks. This high cost explains why loyalty was the most valuable currency in the kingdom. A young warrior couldn't buy his own equipment. He needed a giver of rings, a king or lord who would equip him in exchange for his life. When a lord gave a sword to a follower, he wasn't just giving a weapon, he was making a massive investment. If the warrior fled from battle, he wasn't just being cowardly, he was robbing his lord of a fortune. This is why, in Anglo-Saxon history, crimes against one's own lord were punished with unparalleled brutality. Equipment was the price of blood, and every scar on the armor told the story of an investment that paid off on the battlefield. Understanding this value changes how we see every duel and every cavalry charge. It wasn't just men fighting, it was the greatest riches of a nation colliding in mud and blood. Social mobility in the Dark Ages was a narrow, steep path, often paved with corpses. Nevertheless, it existed. Just as Duncan the Tall begins his journey as a lowland boy in King's Landing, serving a wandering knight to one day earn his own spurs, Anglo-Saxon society possessed mechanisms of mobility that depended almost entirely on military prowess and luck. At the top of the pyramid was the king. At the base, the slaves and the ceorls, free peasants. Among them, the figure that would define the era emerged. The thegn. One thegn, essentially, he was a member of the warrior aristocracy. But how did one become one? Unlike the nobility of later centuries, which was strictly hereditary and bureaucratic, in the early centuries of the Heptarchy, the status of thegnet could be conquered. The laws of King Athelstan, centuries later, would codify something that was already happening in practice. If a prosperous peasant managed to acquire 5 hydras of land, enough area to support his family and generate surplus, a church, a kitchen, and, crucially, provided specialized military service to the king, he could be recognized as a thegn. This transition was the historical equivalent of earning a knighthood. The aspiring warrior needed to leave behind the plow and embrace the shield. He would then frequent the banquet hall of his lord, the medusal door, a mead hall, where politics were conducted over sips of drink and promises of loyalty. The life of thegnet was a life of readiness. While the common peasant only fought when the kingdom was invaded, the so-called lighthouse, the thegn, he was a professional. He trained daily, hunted to stay in shape, and was the first to answer the call to war. The similarity to Dunk's journey is striking in the aspect of legitimization. Dunk spends half his story trying to prove he is a true knight, often without having the documents or lineage to prove it. In the Saxon world, a landless man who claimed to be a knight was a true knight. Then he would face the same skepticism. Identity was public. Everyone knew who his lord was and who his father was. To be a wandering warrior without a land base was to live on a tightrope. If you won a battle and received land from the king, you became a patriarch of a new lineage. If you failed, you were just another anonymous body in a mass grave. This warrior class was not merely a military elite. It was the engine of change in a Britain that was ceasing to be a collection of isolated farms and becoming an organized state, where service to the throne was the only social elevator available. In the heart of Anglo-Saxon society, before kingdom borders were defined by maps, they were drawn by handshakes and oaths sworn by the sword. To understand why Dunk is so obsessed with honor, and why medieval warriors acted in ways that seem irrational to us today, we need to understand the word, Schläford. This is the origin of the English word, lord, but its original meaning was much more visceral, the giver of bread or protector of bread. Unlike our modern system, where we obey impersonal laws and institutions, the Saxon obeyed a man. The world was a dark and dangerous place, full of impenetrable forests and lurking enemies. Alone, a man was nothing. He was a werewolf, lips a pariah whom anyone could kill without facing punishment. To have security, he needed a master. In exchange for protection and sustenance, the bread, the warrior offered his life. This was not a commercial transaction. It was a mystical bond. In the literature of the time, as in the poem, The Wanderer, the greatest pain a man could feel was not the death of his family, but the death of his lord, which left him wandering, homeless and without purpose. Exactly the state Dunk finds himself in at the beginning of his journey after the death of Sir Arlan of Centafia. This loyalty superseded written laws. If your lord entered an unjust war, you fought for him. If he was murdered, your only mission on earth was to avenge him or die trying. To retreat from a battlefield where your lord had fallen was a mark of eternal infamy. It is said that at the Battle of Maldon, the Saxon warriors refused to accept any terms of surrender after the fall of their leader, preferring total massacre rather than live in a world where they had failed to protect him. The lord, in turn, had heavy obligations. He couldn't just accumulate wealth. He needed to be generous. A king who hoarded his gold was considered a flawed king, a miser. He needed to distribute silver rings, swords, and precious robes during banquets in the mead hall. This economy of gifts ensured that the best warriors remained by his side. When we see Dunk reluctant to sell his armor or his horse to eat, he is experiencing the dilemma of the wandering warrior. If he loses the symbols of his class, he loses the bond that makes him a free man before the lords. In the Anglo-Saxon world, freedom was the right to choose to whom you swore your sword, and honor was the strength to keep that oath until the raven came to claim your soul on the battlefield. One of the most fascinating dynamics of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It's like seeing Egg, a prince of the Targaryen royal lineage, shaving his head and sleeping on the floor as a squire to a poor knight. To the modern viewer, this seems like an eccentricity of George R.R. Martin, but it is actually one of the most authentic practices of medieval and ancient nobility, the system of fosterage, shared upbringing. In the real history of the kingdoms of Britain and among the Scandinavian tribes, it was extremely rare for a king's son to be raised by his own biological parents within the palace. The fosterage, it was a political and pedagogical tool. A king would send his son to be raised in the court of an ally, or even a trusted vassal. The objective was twofold. First, to create artificial blood ties. The foster father and the foster brother were often stronger bonds than biological ones. In the event of a contested succession or civil war, you would hardly betray the man who taught you to hunt and wield a spear. Second, it served to toughen the heir. A prince surrounded by servants and luxury would become a weak king. As a squire or pupil in another household, he learned discipline, obedience, and the realities of life outside the bubble of royalty. In the case of the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, the young nobleman was sent to learn the arts of the free man: horsemanship, customary law, reading runes or Christian texts, and shield handling. He did not receive special treatment for being the son of whom he was. On the contrary, he was expected to prove himself worthy of his lineage through effort. Egg, by traveling with Dunk, is undergoing the ultimate test of fosterage. He sees the hunger, the injustice on the roads, and the lives of ordinary people. Historically, this practice shaped leaders like Alfred the Great, who had a diverse and international education by the standards of the time. The system also served as a form of peace guarantee. If two kingdoms made a treaty, the exchange of children to be raised in each other's court functioned as a system of luxury hostages. No one would attack a neighbor knowing that their heir was under the enemy's roof. Thus, Egg's journey is not just a master-apprentice adventure. It reflects an era in which a leader's education was not done in classrooms, but in the sweat of travel, in service to others, and in the understanding that, to command, a king must first learn to serve and understand the weight of the crown he will one day wear. There was a time, between the consolidation of the Saxon kingdoms and the arrival of the first Viking ships, that historians sometimes call a period of maturation. By the 8th century, Britain was no longer a chaotic mix of migrating tribes, but a land of powerful monarchs like Offa of Mercia. This period, which bears similarities to the years of peace under the reign of Diron II in Westeros, was marked by cultural and economic development that suggested the Dark Ages were behind them. The Peace of Kings was maintained by an incipient bureaucracy and the Catholic Church, which unified the kingdoms under a single faith, even though they were politically divided. Offa, for example, was so powerful that he corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal. He ordered the construction of the famous Offa's Wall, a gigantic earthen barrier to mark the border with the Welsh. Trade flourished. Saxon silver coins were found in distant markets, and monasteries became centers of wealth and learning, accumulating treasures of gold, illuminated books, and sacred relics. But this peace was an illusion of security. Stability depended entirely on the personal strength of the reigning king. There was no standing national army. The defense of the kingdom was based on the oaths we discussed earlier. The monasteries, where most of England's wealth was concentrated, were built in secluded locations, such as islands or coastal promontories, to encourage meditation. For a Christian Saxon, the thought of anyone attacking a sacred place was unthinkable. The fear of God was the best bulwark. They lived in a world of clear rules, the right of asylum, the sanctity of churches, and codes of conduct among Christian warriors. What they failed to realize was that, while they debated theology and county boundaries in the North Sea, a new force was being forged by necessity and overpopulation. The Norsemen did not share their faith, did not respect their sacred sites, and did not follow their rules of war. The Peace of Kings was, in fact, a period of complacency. The Saxon kingdoms became fat and sluggish. They had much to lose and little experience in facing an enemy that wanted not only land or tribute, but fought with a nihilism and ferocity that the Saxons had forgotten since the days of their pagan ancestors. The stage was set. On one side, a rich, fragmented, and pious civilization. On the other, hungry wolves waiting for winter to pass to test the defenses of a world that considered itself too safe. On June 8, 793 AD, the history of Western Europe changed forever. If Game of Thrones, there was the fall of the wall, the real story had the desecration of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was the Holy Isle, the spiritual heart of the Kingdom of Northumbria, a place of absolute peace where monks copied precious manuscripts. When square sails and dragon-shaped prows appeared on the horizon, the monks didn't take up arms. They took up crosses. They believed divine protection was impenetrable. They were tragically wrong. The attack was swift, brutal, and unprecedented. The Vikings not only stole gold and jewels from the altars, they massacred the monks, trampled the relics, and took the survivors as slaves. For the Christian world of the time, this was not just a war crime. It was a sign of the apocalypse. The chronicler Alcuin wrote at the time, "Never before had such terror appeared in Britain." The cultural shock was equivalent to what we would feel today if an alien civilization attacked a hospital or a historical monument for no apparent reason. This event shattered the aesthetic of medieval warfare. Until then, wars in the Heptarchy were disputes between noble cousins over borders. There was a protocol. Lindisfarne showed that there was a new player on the board who didn't follow protocols. The Vikings attacked a weak point that no one thought to defend, because it was a religious site. They proved that the sea, which the Saxons saw as a protective barrier, was actually a highway for invaders. The psychological impact was profound. From 793 onwards, fear became a constant in the lives of the Anglo-Saxons. The question was no longer, with the Vikings would return, but when the Saxon cavalry and their lords, so proud of their titles and lineages, found themselves powerless against an enemy that vanished into the mist before any army could be summoned. Lindisfarne was the end of the innocence of the Dark Ages. From then on, the Seven Kingdoms would have to evolve or be devoured. And for you who are following this epic journey with us, Lindisfarne serves as a reminder. History is made of moments where the unthinkable happens. If you are enjoying this deep dive, be sure to leave your like. This helps bring this knowledge to more people who, like you, seek the truth behind the legends. In George R.R. Martin's fiction, dragons are weapons of mass destruction that shift the balance of the world. In the real history of the High Middle Ages, the technological equivalent of the dragon was the Drakkar, the Viking ship. But the terror it inspired didn't just come from its appearance, with prows carved in the shapes of serpents and monsters. It came from naval engineering that was centuries ahead of anything the Anglo-Saxons possessed at the time. The Norse ship was a masterpiece of flexibility and efficiency. Unlike the heavy Roman galleys or Saxon cargo ships, the Viking ship was built using the clinker technique, overlapping planks, which allowed the hull to flex with the waves instead of fighting against them. This made it incredibly fast and stable on the open sea. However, the real secret that terrified the kingdoms of England was its shallow draft. A fully loaded Viking ship needed less than a meter of depth to navigate. This meant that the Vikings didn't need ports. They could sail up narrow rivers, penetrating kilometers into enemy territory, and anchor directly on the beaches or shores of villages that felt protected by their distance from the sea. For a Saxon peasant, the appearance of those square sails striped red and white on the horizon was the announcement of the end. The ship was, at the same time, a troop transport, an assault platform, and a status symbol. The Vikings loved their ships as much as a knight loved his horse. They gave them names like Sea Deer or Beast of the Wave. When the ship reached the sand, it became a base of operations. In minutes, hundreds of warriors could disembark, plunder a church, and leave before then where he could mount his horse and sound the call to war. This unprecedented mobility created a war of shock and awe. The Anglo-Saxons were accustomed to slow land wars, where armies met in open fields after weeks of maneuvering. The Vikings changed the rules. They were ghosts that emerged from the fog and disappeared into the tide. The Viking ship was not merely a means of transport. It was the tool that allowed a relatively small population, hailing from the frozen lands of the north, to dominate and terrorize far more populous and wealthy kingdoms. It was naval supremacy that allowed the birth of the Viking Age, transforming the North Sea into a Scandinavian lake, and Britain into a hunting ground. Forget what you see in the movies, where battles are choreographed one-on-one duels and heroes leaping between enemies with spinning swords. The reality of combat between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings was claustrophobic, slow, and terrifyingly intimate. The name for this tactic was shield wall, or shield city in Old Norse. It referred to a mass of men pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, where the objective was not only to wound the enemy, but to maintain the integrity of the line at all costs. The moment two shield walls clashed, the battle ceased to be a fight and became a contest of brute physical strength. Imagine hundreds of men pushing each other, metal creaking against leather-reinforced wood, the smell of sweat, iron, and fear. The warriors in the front line used their shields to create an impenetrable barrier, while the men behind sought gaps to strike with spears or axes over their comrades' shoulders. If a man fell, the hole had to be filled instantly. If the line broke, the battle turned into a massacre, for it was in the flight that most soldiers died. This form of combat demanded ironclad discipline and absolute trust in the man beside you, a perfect echo of the brotherhood we see between Dunk and Egg, or between the knights of Westeros. It wasn't individual skill that won the day, but the cohesion of the group. Shield wall battles could last for hours of sheer physical exhaustion, where victory often went to whoever had the strongest lungs or the firmest ground beneath their feet. That's where the importance of a commanding voice comes in. A leader wasn't just a fighter. He was the anchor that prevented panic from spreading. If this story of strategy and bloodshed surprised you, leave a like right now. By liking and subscribing, you help spread historical knowledge and ensure that more epic content like this reaches other enthusiasts of the past. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? I'd love to know how far our shield wall of knowledge is reaching. And of course, if there's any historical figure or battle you'd like to see analyzed here, leave your suggestion. The shield wall tactic is what makes accounts of battles like Hastings or Ethandune so dramatic. There was no room for solitary heroism. The individual was swallowed up by the unit. The war cry, the impact of the timber and the rain of arrows transformed the field into a meat grinder, where survival depended on a single oath. I will not take a step back, lest my brother die. When Dunk travels the roads of Westeros, he often encounters dilapidated inns and dangerous paths. In Anglo-Saxon England, the experience of traveling was an exercise in living archaeology and constant danger. The Saxons lived surrounded by the ruins of a civilization they did not fully understand. They called the stone buildings and walls left by the Romans the work of the giants. Although the Roman roads were deteriorating, they were still the only safe and direct routes across the island. For a traveler, these roads were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they allowed armies and merchants to move quickly. On the other, they were the perfect setting for ambushes. Unlike fiction, where the roads seem busy, 8th and 9th century Britain was largely uninhabited. Between one village and another, there were miles of dense forests, swamps, and moors, where wolves and bandits reigned supreme. Traveling alone, like a wandering knight, was almost an invitation to suicide or enslavement. Inns, like the ones Dunk frequents, were rare. The average traveler depended on the hospitality of monasteries or the legal obligation of local villages to offer shelter. However, the emergence of trading posts and places for exchanging goods near ancient Roman cities created a new social dynamic. At these points you would find the Norse fur trader, the Saxon monk carrying manuscripts, and the mercenary seeking a lord. The road was the only place where castes mixed out of necessity. The contrast between the imposing Roman stone ruins and the humble wooden and straw houses of the Saxons created an atmosphere of melancholy. The Saxons felt they lived in the shadow of a glorious past they would never reach. This feeling of decadence is very present in the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, where the glory of the Targaryens begins to show signs of wear. In real history, Roman roads served as a constant reminder that power is transient. Every mile traveled over those worn stones was a reminder that one day legions marched there, and now only the wind and steel of the new lords dominated the horizon. In Martin's universe, the faith of the Seven is the organized religion and political force, while the old gods represent something primal and wild. In Britain, we experience a nearly identical conflict: Roman Catholic Christianity versus Germanic and Norse paganism. But this wasn't just a battle for souls. It was a war of political systems. Christianity brought something the small Saxon kings desperately desired: the idea of divine right and a centralized bureaucracy. When a Saxon king converted, he wasn't just accepting a new god. He was gaining access to bishops who could read and write, who could draft laws and organize the tax system. The church offered a structure that unified the kingdom. On the other hand, Viking paganism was decentralized, focused on personal honor and glory in battle to reach Valhalla. For the Vikings, the gods were business partners or powerful ancestors, not absolute moral judges. This made the Norse unpredictable in the eyes of Christians, who saw attacks on monasteries as acts of demons, while the Vikings saw only easy and wealthy targets. Religion was used as a tool for assimilation. Christian kings often demanded that defeated Viking leaders be baptized as a condition for peace. This created a bond of spiritual fatherhood between the kings, theoretically making them allies. However, many Vikings saw baptism as just another ritual. Some even got baptized multiple times just to earn the white silk robes given to converts. This tension created complex characters, men who lived in two worlds. There were warriors who wore Thor's hammer and the cross of Christ on the same necklace just in case. The spiritual battlefield was as intense as the physical one. The transition to Christianity was what allowed England to cease being a collection of tribes and become a European state. The price, however, was the destruction of a rich oral and mythological tradition that would only survive in fragments and codified poems. The struggle between the old gods of the North and the new faith of the South shaped the morality, laws, and identity of what would become the English nation. One of the most iconic moments of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it is the Trial of Seven, where Dunk's innocence is decided in a bloody combat. In the real history of the Viking Age and Germanic kingdoms, this was not fiction. It was a legal procedure called holmgang. If a man was insulted, or if there was a land dispute that oral laws could not resolve, the duel was the final court. The logic was simple and brutal. The gods, or fate, would not allow the just man to lose. Unlike later chivalric tournaments, the holmgang, the original practice was surrounded by strict rules to avoid unnecessary deaths, but it was still extremely dangerous. The duel took place in a delimited area, usually a blanket spread on the ground or a small island, hence the name. Holm, which means island. If you left the designated area, you were considered a coward and automatically lost the fight. Each combatant was entitled to a specific number of shields. When all your shields were broken by the opponent's blows, you had to fight only with your weapon and your body. Trial by combat was the ultimate expression of a society where honor was the most precious commodity. To be called Nidingur, a man without honor, an outcast, was worse than death. To clear your name, you had to be willing to bleed. In the Anglo-Saxon context, after Christianization, this practice evolved into ordalism, where the accused had to hold a red-hot iron or plunge their arm into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly in 3 days, God would have proven their innocence. These rituals show that for medieval man, justice was not something human or logical, but something supernatural. Dunk's duel to prove his truth is a direct echo of those men who entered stone circles or deserted islands to let steel decide who had the right to continue living. Strength was seen as an extension of virtue. If you won, it was because your cause was just. This ironclad mentality created warriors of frightening resilience, but also a society where peace was always maintained under the threat of the blade. Unlike the Iron Throne of Westeros, where primogeniture, the eldest son inherits everything, is the sacred rule that plunges the kingdom into war when broken. The Anglo-Saxons operated under a much more fluid and, in some ways, dangerous system, the witan. The term comes from witnagement, which means meeting of wise men. This council, made up of bishops, abbots, and the principal men ealdormen, counts, were the ones who decided who would wear the crown of kingdoms like Wessex or Mercia. In the real story, being the king's eldest son did not guarantee the throne. The witan sought the atheling, the prince of royal blood, who was most capable of leading the army and protecting the people. If the direct heir was a child or a weak man during Viking invasions, the council often chose the boy's uncle or a distant cousin who was a proven warrior. This created intense factional politics. Imagine the level of intrigue. Candidates for the throne needed to convince the members of the witan of their generosity and strength even before the current king died. This system shows that the Saxon monarchy was, in essence, a leadership by consent of the elite. The king was not a god on earth, but the first among equals. If he failed to consult the witan on war or tax decisions, he risked being deposed or abandoned on the battlefield. This balance of power prevented absolute tyrants, but left the kingdom vulnerable to succession crises whenever a king died without an obvious and strong successor. The resemblance to the regency councils or Martin's Small Council is clear, but with a greater degree of regional autonomy. The witan were the guardians of oral tradition and customary law. They were the memory of the kingdom. Without their support, no king could rule for long. This dynamic ensured that only the fittest survived the Heptarchy's Game of Thrones, preparing the ground for leaders who would have to be both shrewd diplomats and ruthless generals. Until the mid-9th century, Vikings were like mosquitoes. They attacked, sucked blood, and left. But in 865 AD, the rules changed. They were no longer just isolated ships. It was the Great Heathen Army, the Great Heathen Army. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan. This force did not come to plunder monasteries and return to Scandinavia. They came to stay. They brought horses, agricultural tools, and a military organization that Britain had never seen before. Unlike previous raids, the Great Army operated with a scorched earth strategy combined with knife diplomacy. They exploited rivalries between the Saxon kingdoms. If Northumbria was in civil war, the Vikings would support one side, destroy the other, and then enslave the survivor. They captured York, Jorvik, and transformed it into a Viking capital, a trading center connecting England to the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. The arrival of this army was the extinction event for most of the kingdoms of the Heptarchy. Within a few years, Northumbria fell. East Anglia was subjugated. Mercia was carved up. The Vikings were no longer foreigners. They were becoming the new masters of the land. They divided the territory among their chieftains, beginning the process of mass colonization. For the Saxons, it seemed as if the world was ending. The pagans were sitting on the thrones of Christian kings. The Great Heathen Army is the historical equivalent of an invasion by the others, or a conquering foreign army that permanently changes the map. They forced the Anglo-Saxons to stop fighting amongst themselves and to consider a radical idea: unification. Either they would become a single people under a single leader, or they would all be swept out to sea. It was the moment of greatest despair in the island's history, where the survival of Saxon culture hung by a hair's breadth and the shield of the only kingdom that still resisted, Wessex. For the viewer of Game of Thrones, the fall of a great house is a traumatic event. In real history, the fall of Northumbria and East Anglia to the Vikings was a brutal lesson in how internal disunity invites external disaster. Northumbria, once the cultural center of Europe with its manuscripts and saints, was mired in civil war between two kings, Osbert and Ella, when Ivar's Vikings arrived. Instead of uniting, they continued fighting until it was too late. The Vikings captured York in a surprise attack during a religious holiday. When the two Saxon kings finally attempted to retake the city, they were massacred. Legend says that King Ella suffered the ritual of the blood eagle, an execution so slow and horrific that many historians still debate whether it was real or a literary invention to depict Viking ferocity. Regardless of the method, The aristocracy of Northumbria was decapitated, and the kingdom became a Norse puppet state. In East Anglia, the fate was equally grim, but with a touch of martyrdom. King Edmund confronted the Vikings and, upon being defeated, was captured. According to accounts, the Vikings demanded that he renounce his faith and rule as a vassal. Edmund refused. He was tied to a tree and used as a target for arrows until his body resembled a porcupine and was then beheaded. He became Saint Edmund the Martyr, but his kingdom ceased to exist as an independent Saxon entity. The speed with which these states fell demonstrates the fragility of the Saxon defensive system of the time. Without a standing army, and without modern fortifications, they relied on single elimination battles. If they lost the battle and the king died, the kingdom died with him. The Vikings not only won battles, they destroyed the administrative and religious structure, replacing bishops with clan chiefs and Christian laws with the customs of Odin. The map of England was being painted red, and silence fell upon the libraries and halls that were once the pride of Britain. Alfred of Wessex is the closest thing that real history has to an epic fantasy hero who rises through wisdom, not just brute strength. Just like Aegon, the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Alfred was not the expected heir. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. No one expected him to live long enough to be king, much less that he would be the only one capable of stemming the Viking tide. Alfred was a sickly man, possibly suffering from Crohn's disease, and preferred books to swords. When his brothers died one by one in battle against the great heathen army, Alfred inherited a kingdom in flames. In 878 AC, after a surprise Viking attack during Christmas, Alfred was forced to flee to the swamps of Athelney with only a handful of followers. It was his lowest point, the king of the swamps. This is where the legend of Alfred burning a peasant woman's bread because he was too distracted thinking about how to save his kingdom originates. He was living the life of a fugitive, a wanderer, just like Dunk on the roads of Westeros. But Alfred used this time for something the Vikings didn't expect. He studied the enemy. He realized he couldn't defeat the Vikings with courage alone. He needed logistics, fortifications, and education. Alfred began organizing a guerrilla resistance, sending secret messengers to the Thengs from Somerset and Wiltshire. He was not just a warrior. He was a strategist who understood that the mind is a king's most powerful weapon. Alfred's rise from a fugitive in the marshes to the victor of Ethandun is the turning point in English history. He not only saved Wessex, he laid the foundations for England's identity. Alfred believed that the people would only be strong if they were educated, so he himself translated books from Latin into Old English, ensuring that knowledge was not the privilege of the few. He was the king who learned to read while others only learned to kill, and that was why he, and not the great warriors who preceded him, became the Great. Warfare in the Viking Age wasn't just about who was best with the axe. It was about who had the last piece of dried meat in winter. The Vikings were masters of siege logistics through famine. When they couldn't take a city or a burh fortress by the walls, they simply sat around and waited. They knew that the Saxon social structure was based on subsistence farming. If the peasants couldn't harvest, the city would die. The Vikings frequently captured local livestock, the currency of the time, and concentrated them in fortified camps. This deprived the Saxons of their main source of food and protein. Without food, the shield wall weakened, diseases spread, and the will to fight disappeared. Often the Vikings demanded the Danegeld, Danish money, a massive tribute in silver to make them leave. But, as the saying of the time goes, once you pay the Danes to leave, you never get rid of the Danes. Alfred and his successors learned this lesson the hard way. To combat this famine logistics, the Saxons had to overhaul their entire defense system. They created the system of burhs. Fortified cities were distributed in such a way that no inhabitant of Wessex was more than a day's journey from a safe location. These fortresses were supplied with grain and protected by permanent garrisons. This war of attrition transformed the landscape of England. Open villages were abandoned in favor of walled settlements. The economy shifted its focus to stockpiling and protecting resources. Famine was a weapon as real and lethal as any fire-breathing dragon. Understanding the logistics behind the Viking invasions shows us that history is not only made of heroic battles, but also of difficult decisions made on empty stomachs, and by the desperate need to protect the next harvest. On the pages of The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, in the inns, the meeting point is where Dunk uncovers conspiracies, and Egg hears the kingdom's gossip. In real history, the inns and taverns along the river routes and old roads were the true nerve centers of Britain. In a world without newspapers or the internet, information traveled at the speed of a horse or a boat, and whoever held the freshest news held the power. In these places, the distinction between friend and foe became blurred. A Viking merchant might be sitting next to a Saxon scout, both feigning indifference while assessing each other's strength. Trade was what kept these places alive. Unlike the vision of total war, trade between Saxons and Norsemen rarely stopped. The preferred currency was hack silver, chopped silver. If a Viking wanted to buy supplies or information, he didn't necessarily use coins. He would take his silver bracelet, cut a piece off with his axe, and weigh it on a precision scale. This fragmented economy shows the pragmatic nature of the time. Value lay in the raw metal and the purity of the silver, not in the effigy of a king who could fall next week. These inns also served as nests of spies. Lone travelers were subtly interrogated by the innkeepers, who often sold information to local landowners. If a group of well-equipped men passed by on a secondary road, the Thegan people from the region would find out within a few hours. Life in those places was tense. A wrong word or a poorly disguised accent could lead to a deadly duel in the courtyard, much like the atmosphere of distrust that permeates Dunk's travels when he hides the true identity of his squire. Furthermore, the inn was a place of cultural mixing. It was there that the first Norse terms began to enter the Saxon vocabulary. Basic modern English words for everyday objects were forged in this commercial and social contact. The inn was not just a place of shelter. It was the laboratory where the future language and the future economy of England were being cooked up in the same cauldron that served stew to exhausted warriors. Fiction loves the image of shield maiden, the Viking warrior who fights side by side with men. In real history, although there is archaeological evidence of women buried with weapons, such as the famous warrior of Burka, the female role in the Viking and Saxon ages was far more complex and politically powerful than simply wielding a shield. In the Saxon world, figures like Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, showed that a woman could be the strategic mind behind the survival of an entire kingdom. Daughter of Alfred the Great, Ethelfled not only ruled Mercia after her husband's death, but she led armies and planned the construction of fortified cities, burhs. She was instrumental in the reconquest of territories occupied by the Vikings. She was respected by hardened warriors not for her physical strength, but for her impeccable leadership. On the Nordic side, women had property rights and divorce rights that were unthinkable in other parts of Christian Europe. They were the keepers of the farm keys, a symbol of absolute authority over the family's livelihood, while the men were away raiding or trading. This female autonomy created an interesting social dynamic. While men were killing each other at shield walls, it was often the women who kept diplomacy and the economy functioning. Marriages were not just romantic ties. They were peace treaties sealed with blood and lineage. A noblewoman was a weaver of peace, peace weaver, intended to unite two rival families. If the marriage failed, the war would return in full force. The influence of women also extended to the spiritual realm. Saxon abbesses governed dual monasteries for men and women, and were close advisors to kings. They were the guardians of education and memory. Therefore, the true warrior of that time often did not wear chainmail, but rather a crown or a veil, and her battles were fought in council halls, ensuring that her lineage survived an era that seemed determined to erase the past. In The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Dunk is often judged by what he wears. His old cloak and simple armor say a lot about his standing. In medieval Britain, clothing was your calling card. In a world where most people wore coarse brown or gray wool, color and fabric were the ultimate markers of status. An elite warrior didn't just want to be strong. He needed to be strong, opinion-rich. The greatest symbol of prestige for a Saxon nobleman or a Viking chieftain was silk. Interestingly, the silk came from far away, from Constantinople, Byzantium, and even the Silk Road in China. How did this fabric reach a cold island in the north? Through Viking trade networks that descended the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea. A piece of Byzantine silk sewn onto the edge of a woolen cloak was the equivalent of wearing a luxury watch today. It showed that you had international connections and enough silver to waste on something purely decorative. The colors also spoke volumes. The deep blue obtained from the plant dyeing mill, and vibrant red was expensive. Saxon nobles loved embroidery in gold thread and gilded bronze brooches inlaid with red garnets. Style, partitioned. A gentleman's brooch was not merely a fashion statement, it was a store of value. In times of need, it could be traded for supplies or used as a bribe. The symbolism of clothing extended to the battlefield. A leader needed to be recognizable from afar so his men knew where to regroup. Colorful cloaks and ornate helmets served as beacons in the chaos. When Dunk paints the elm and shooting star symbol on his shield, he is following the same age-old logic. In a world of dirty, armed men, his mark and appearance are the only things that separate a hero from a highwayman. Clothing was the social armor that protected the warrior's reputation as much as iron protected his chest. Alfred the Great's greatest stroke of genius wasn't a magic sword, but an urban planning idea, the burrs system. Realizing that the Vikings were winning through mobility, Alfred decided to stop time. He transformed Wessex into a network of fortified cities. Each burhit was designed so that no peasant would be more than 30 kilometers from a protective wall. This meant that, at the first sign of an invasion, everyone could seek refuge before the Vikings arrived. These fortresses were not just earthen walls, they were economic centers. Alfred forced people to live and trade within them, burrs, creating the first planned cities since the departure of the Romans. The maintenance of the walls was a legal obligation of all landowners. The system of burgol headage. If you owned land, you had to send men to repair the wall and guard the towers. It was a tax in the form of labor that ensured collective survival. This strategy changed warfare. The Vikings, who detested long sieges, suddenly encountered resistance at every turn. They could no longer ride freely across the countryside looting everything. They had to face prepared garrisons. Burrs they served as bases for the Saxon counterattack. When a Viking band grew tired of trying to storm a wall, they were pursued by fresh troops emerging from within the fortress. This system was the embryo of modern English cities. Many city names end in "berry" or "borough" because of this. Alfred's network defense was what prevented Wessex from following the fate of Northumbria. It was a victory of engineering over ferocity. While the Vikings built boats to escape, the Saxons built walls to stay. This transition from the wandering warrior to the garrison soldier is what allowed the survival of Anglo-Saxon culture and the eventual unification of the kingdom. We reached the point where England literally became two countries in one. After years of conflict, Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum signed a treaty establishing the Dane Law. The map was cut in half by an imaginary line that followed the old Roman road Watling Street. To the south and west, the laws were Saxon, and the king was Alfred. To the north and east, the law was Danish law. In the Dane Law, Norse culture flourished. Towns had Norse names, ending in "by", such as Derby or Whitby. The legal system was different. The Danes introduced the concept of jury and a division of land based on warrior groups. It wasn't a brutal military occupation, but an agricultural colonization. Vikings and Saxons began living side by side, intermarrying and exchanging farming techniques. Over time, this scar on the map became the area of greatest cultural fertility on the island. For an inhabitant of the time, crossing the Danelaw border was like entering a different kingdom. Although the language was still mutually intelligible, it was an armed and tense peace. Wessex looked to the Danelaw as territory to be reconquered. The Danes looked to the south as a source of wealth to be exploited. This division created a regional identity in northern England that persists to this day, with accents and customs that still echo the DNA of the Nordic invaders. The Danelaw was the first great example of enforced multiculturalism in Britain. It proved that, despite the bloodshed, trade and coexistence were stronger than hatred. England would not be cleansed of Vikings, it would be made of Vikings. The fusion of these two laws and these two peoples is what gave England its unique strength, transforming a fragmented island into a power that would learn to absorb its conquerors and turn them into subjects. In the world of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, in 9th century Britain, road justice was a brutal extension of the need for order. For the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, The worst thing a man could be was a lawbreaker. Lips, a wolf. The term used for criminals expelled from society. If you committed an unforgivable crime, such as treason or dishonorable murder, you lost your legal protection. This meant that anyone could kill you in the street without it being considered a crime. You literally became a wolf's head. For a man like Dunk, traveling without clear proof of his lineage or service to a lord, the road was a legal minefield. If a band of local warriors stopped him, he had no court to appeal to. He had only his word and his sword. Justice was administered locally by the local authorities. Reeve, the king's official from where the word comes. Sheriff. The system was based on weregild, the price of man. If you killed someone, you would have to pay a sum to the victim's family based on their social status. One the nit was worth 6 times more than a peasant. If you didn't have the money to pay the weregild otherwise, you became either a slave or a fugitive. This harsh justice ensured that no one traveled alone for long. Groups of travelers formed temporary peace guilds, vowing to protect one another. Gallows at crossroads were a common sight, serving as a grim warning that mercy was a luxury the state could not afford. Order was maintained through fear and collective responsibility. If a crime occurred in a village and the inhabitants did not turn in the culprit, the entire village was fined. Road justice transformed the landscape into a place of constant surveillance. Every stranger was a potential enemy or a fugitive. When we see Dunk trying to maintain his integrity in such a hostile environment, we understand that honor was not merely a moral choice. It was the only thing that prevented a man from being hunted like a wild animal by the king's patrols. The law wasn't in books, it was on the tip of the spear, and in the respect you managed to command from other travelers. Unlike Game of Thrones, while the White Walkers are a real physical threat, the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings lived in a world where the supernatural was a psychological reality that shaped warfare tactics. They firmly believed that the deep forests were inhabited by dangerous elves, Orkney monsters and drakes, dragons. The poem Beowulf it was not seen as pure fantasy, but as a tale about the real dangers lurking on the fringes of civilization. This fear was used militarily. Night attacks were rare and feared, not only because of the lack of visibility, but because the night belonged to creatures of darkness. The Vikings, with their helmets and dragon prows, deliberately exploited these superstitions. By painting their shields with mythical beasts and howling like wolves before battle, the famous berserkers, they tried to convince the Saxons that they were not just men, but demons or servants of Odin. Psychological terror was half the battle. The Christian religion attempted to combat this by blessing swords and banners, transforming war into a spiritual crusade against monstrous paganism. The Saxons carried relics of saints onto the battlefield, believing that the bones of a martyr could repel Norse spells. Every eclipse or comet was interpreted as a sign of impending disaster, often leading entire armies to desert or seek hasty peace terms. Superstition also dictated the timing of campaigns. No one wanted to fight on the winter solstice or in places considered cursed, such as ancient Roman cemeteries or stone circles. Understanding the mind of the medieval warrior means accepting that, for them, the wind blowing through the trees could be a warning from a god or the whisper of a specter. Courage was not only about facing the enemy's steel, but also about facing the constant fear of an invisible world that could decide their fate before the first blow was even struck. While fiction often focuses on the glory of looting gold and silver, the historical truth is that the most lucrative commodity of the Viking Age was not metal, but human beings. The Vikings were the greatest slave traders, called slaves, thralls, of Europe. Cities like Dublin in Ireland and York in England flourished as markets where men, women, and children captured in raids were sold to the Caliphate of Baghdad or to the Byzantine Empire. Slavery was the invisible foundation that sustained the Nordic economy and, to a lesser extent, the Saxon economy. Thrall, they had no rights. They were considered movable property, like an ox or a horse. They performed the heaviest and most degrading work on the farms, allowing free men time to train and participate in Viking expeditions in the summer. The threat of being taken as a slave was the greatest terror of the Saxon peasant, far worse than a quick death in battle. The trafficking of people was a complex international network. The Vikings traded Saxon captives for spices, silk, and the famous steel swords, Ulfbert tof the Rhine. This trade dehumanized the borders. Often a captured nobleman was held for ransom, while the poor were chained and sent to the markets of the East. It was this economy of human flesh that financed the construction of ever larger fleets and the establishment of permanent Viking settlements. The transition to Christianity began to undermine this practice, as the Church prohibited the enslavement of fellow Christians, though it took centuries for this to disappear completely. When analyzing the rise of medieval kingdoms, it is crucial to remember that the splendor of crowns and the beauty of cathedrals were often financed by the misery of thousands of anonymous people who were torn from their homes and sold as merchandise in the global market of the Dark Ages. In the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, we see how marriages are the anchors of Westeros's politics. In the real history of the Heptarchy, the term for a noblewoman given in marriage to seal a treaty was Fredewebe, the weaver of peace. Marriage was the most effective way to transform an enemy into an ally, uniting the destinies of two noble houses through the blood of a future child. If two kings wanted to stop a generations-long war, they exchanged daughters. These alliances, however, were fragile and fraught with personal tragedy. The peacemaker often found herself in an impossible position, living in the court of the man who may have killed her father or brothers, having to provide him with heirs. If war broke out again, she was the first victim of distrust on both sides. A famous example is the sister of Alfred the Great, who married the king of Mercia to strengthen the alliance against the Vikings, serving as a vital political bridge for decades. The Vikings also entered this power game. Danish leaders married daughters of Saxon nobility to legitimize their claim to conquered lands. This accelerated cultural integration. Within a generation, the grandson of a Viking invader could consider himself a Saxon nobleman with legitimate claims to the throne. The mixed blood in royal beds was what ultimately dissolved the borders of the Danelaw. These alliances were not based on love, but on pure dynastic strategy. The noblewoman's body was the map on which the treaties were written. Through these marriages, England ceased to be a battleground of rival clans and became a network of interconnected families. Peace was not a signed document, but a shared grandchild bearing the name and blood of both sides of the conflict. In May of 878 AD, the history of England was decided on a hillside in Edington, Ethandun. On one side, the great heathen army led by Guthrum, which had already conquered almost everything. On the other, Alfred the Great, leading the remnants of Wessex. It was the historical equivalent of the Battle of the Bastards, or any epic climax, the last stand of a culture that refused to die. The battle was a classic shield-wall clash that lasted all day. Alfred, demonstrating inspiring leadership, managed to hold his lines together against Viking ferocity. Accounts say the clash of shields could be heard for miles. In the end, the Saxons prevailed. It wasn't just a military victory. It was the moment Alfred proved the Vikings weren't invincible. He pursued them to their stronghold and besieged them until hunger, the very weapon the Vikings used, forced them to surrender. The consequences of Ethandun were monumental. Guthrum was not only defeated, he was forced to convert to Christianity, with Alfred serving as his godfather. This transformed the conflict from a war of extermination into a political dispute between Christian rulers. The Treaty of Wedmore, which followed, established the official borders of the Danelaw and gave Wessex the necessary breathing room to begin the unification of England. Without Ethandun, there would be no England. The island would be a Scandinavian province, and the English language, as we know it, would probably never have existed. It was the climax of a journey of pain and perseverance. Alfred emerged from the battlefield not only as the King of Wessex, but as the guardian of a people who, for the first time, began to see themselves as English. The steel of Ethandun forged the backbone of a nation that would learn to resist and flourish even in the shadows of invasion. Often history focuses on the blade of the sword, but Alfred the Great knew that true sovereignty was written in silver. After the victory at Ethandun, his greatest battle was not military, but economic. Alfred realized that to be a true king, he needed a stable currency that people could trust. He initiated a massive monetary reform, issuing the silver penny, bearing his effigy and the name of London. This was a political masterstroke. Whenever someone used that coin in the marketplace, they were acknowledging Alfred's authority. The coin was the internet of the Middle Ages. It carried the image of the king to the most remote corners where he could never go personally. By guaranteeing the weight and purity of the silver, Alfred encouraged international trade. Byzantine and Frankish merchants preferred Wessex coinage because they knew it was not adulterated. This filled the kingdom's coffers, allowing Alfred to finance the construction of the Burs and Pay for standing armies. In the Danelaw, the Vikings, who previously depended on hack silver punched silver, they began to imitate Alfred's coins. They saw that a monetary economy was far more efficient for trade than carrying metal bars and scales everywhere. This economic standardization did more for the unification of England than 10 battles. When Saxons and Vikings began using the same currency to buy bread and livestock, cultural barriers began to crumble. Alfred proved that silver can be sharper than steel when it comes to building a lasting empire. If in Westeros we have maesters and bard songs like Jada, in Anglo-Saxon England we had the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Scops, oral poets. Alfred knew that whoever controls the past controls the future. He ordered the compilation of the Chronicle, a year-by-year historical record of the kingdom's events. It wasn't just history, it was propaganda. The Chronicle painted Wessex as the last bastion of civilization against pagan barbarism, creating a narrative of manifest destiny for the English people. Meanwhile, the oral tradition of Scops, the atmosphere remained vibrant in the mead halls. These poets were the historians of the common people. They recited poems such as Beowulf, the Battle of Malden, transforming real warriors into immortal legends. For a warrior of that era, the greatest reward wasn't gold, but the lauf, the fame that would survive in a song after his death. This created a culture of suicidal heroism that Dunk would certainly recognize, the idea that his name is the only thing that truly belongs to him. Writing, brought by monks, began to replace oral tradition, but the two coexisted for centuries. The Vikings, in turn, had their sagas and runestones. They engraved their deeds on gigantic rocks for gods and men to see. The tension between the monk's pen and the bard's song shaped our understanding of the period. What we know today is a mixture of administrative narratives and heroic myths, a reminder that history is not just what happened, but how we choose to tell what happened. After the Treaty of Wedmore and the stabilization of the Danelaw, something silent and powerful began to happen, the merging of DNA. Thousands of Vikings settled as farmers. They were no longer raiders, they were neighbors. Within a few generations, the distinction between Norse and Saxon became almost impossible to discern in physical appearance. Interethnic marriages became the norm, creating a new population that carried both Norse resilience and Saxon social structure. Modern genetic studies show that Viking heritage in England runs deep, especially in the north and east, the ancient Danelaw. But this heritage isn't limited to genes. It's in family names, town names, and crucially, the language. Basic English words like sky, egg, knife, husband, and law, they are all of Nordic origin. We don't speak pure Old English. We speak a hybrid language born in the heat of this forced integration. This biological fusion is what gave England its unique strength. The English that emerged from this era was not a pure race, but a genetic and cultural mongrel, perfectly adapted to survive in a hostile world. The scar of the Viking invasion was not a wound that never healed, but a welding mark that joined two pieces of metal into something far stronger than the originals. Alfred's journey of resistance resulted in a people who were heirs to two worlds, ready to dominate the seas that once terrified them. Even 1,000 years later, the land of England continues to yield secrets from that bloody era. Treasures such as Hoxneor, the one of Staffordshire, they show that the ground was the safest bank during the Dark Ages. But there is a mystery that haunts historians. Why were so many massive treasures buried and never recovered? The most accepted theory is that of offering or panic. During Viking invasions, Saxon lords buried their fortunes, waiting for the enemy to pass. If they were killed or enslaved, the secret of the treasure died with them. There is also the mystery of burials in boats, like the famous one. Sutton Hoo, although predating the Vikings, he set the standard. The idea that a king would be buried with an entire ship, Byzantine jewels, and luxurious weapons suggests a belief that wealth could cross the boundary of death. Some archaeologists believe that Viking ships still exist buried beneath modern cities like London or York, waiting to be discovered. These lost treasures are a true echo of the dragon's gold of fiction. Each silver coin and each gold brooch found by a metal detector today is a fragment of a life interrupted by violence or hope. They remind us that the history we read in books is only the surface of a sea of forgotten events, buried under mud and time, waiting for someone with the right curiosity to bring them back to light. Pop culture immortalized Uhtred de Bebbanburg of the Last Kingdom, but who was the real man behind the myth? History tells us of a lineage of Saxon nobles who ruled Bebbanburg, with almost complete autonomy. They were the wolves of the north. While the rest of Northumbria fell under Viking rule, Bamburgh remained an impregnable Saxon stronghold atop its coastal cliff. Historians debate whether the literary Uhtred is an amalgamation of several real leaders of the family. Bamburgh. There was an Uhtred the Bold, but he lived long after Alfred the Great. However, the figure of the warrior divided between two worlds is historically plausible. Many North Saxon nobles were raised as hostages or allies of Vikings, becoming bilingual and bicultural. This duality was a survival tool. Bamburgh represents the resistance that official history often ignores. While Wessex was credited with saving England, these northern lords kept the flame alive in a far more hostile and isolated environment. They were the true guardians of the wall, protecting what remained of Saxon culture against the Picts to the north and the Vikings to the south. The mystery of their survival and their shadowy alliances is what gives characters like Uhtred and Dunk that aura of men out of their time, fighting for an honor that the world around them seems to have forgotten. By the end of the 10th century, the world of Dunk and Egg, or its historical equivalent, was dying. Primitive chivalry, based on personal loyalty and the charisma of the lord, was being replaced by a colder, more efficient system. The kings of a unified England began to rule through written edicts and centralized tax systems. The wandering warrior, seeking a lord on the roads, was becoming an anachronism. Warfare has changed too. The construction of burhs, the rise of heavy cavalry, Frankish influence, made pitched battles rarer and sieges more common. The system of lighthouse, the peasant militia, was reformed to be more professional. Power now lay not only in brute force, but in the ability to organize supplies for thousands of men for months on end. Bureaucracy, and not just courage, came to decide the winner. This transition is what Martin portrays as the end of the golden age of chivalry. In real history, it was the birth of the modern state. The king no longer needed to know every warrior by name. He needed a record of who owned each piece of land. The individualistic spirit of the Viking and the blood oath of the Saxon were tamed by the need for order and stability. The age of heroes was giving way to the age of administrators, setting the stage for the final clash that would change the island forever. The arrival of the Normans in 1066. Our journey concludes in a setting the ancient kings of the Heptarchy would never have recognized. After centuries of blood and silver, England has finally emerged. We leave behind the 7 fragmented kingdoms and find a unified kingdom under the lineage of Alfred. Economically, the island is now a monetary powerhouse, with vibrant cities like London and York serving as commercial hubs linking the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Politically, it is a centralized, Christian, and sophisticated state. However, this unification came at a price. Viking culture was not expelled. It was absorbed, leaving a permanent mark on the language, law, and temperament of the people. But on the southern horizon, a new threat was forming. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who became French nobles, looked at England's wealth with the same hungry eyes as their ancestors. The stage was set for the Battle of Hastings, which would definitively end the Anglo-Saxon era. The England that Alfred saved in the marshes of Athelney became the most coveted jewel in Europe. The journey of resistance, adaptation, and cultural fusion created a nation that was greater than the sum of its parts. The economic landscape was one of prosperity, but the political landscape was one of latent tension. The history of Anglo-Saxons and Vikings was not a story of victors and vanquished, but of the painful birth of an identity that would define the Western world. And so, Britain ceased to be an abandoned Roman province and became the heart of a new kind of power, forged in the cold of the north and tempered by the fires of war.